And it seems that Cuba is finally on the brink of falling. Pardon that. And it seems that the dictatorship quickly shut down social media report feeds. So, let's see what's going on, guys. Anti-government protesters gather at Maximo Gomez Monument in Havana. Cubans took to the streets Sunday in what Cuban activists and U.S. politicians are calling the biggest demonstrations in decades. According to the social media feeds, which Cuba's communist dictatorship quickly shut down as U.S. news outlets began collecting them, hundreds of citizens shouted freedom to protest shortages of food and medicine in several cities across the island. Because this is a familiar story that we're all used to already. When you enact communism, you get bread lines. People are dying of hunger, shouted one woman in Spanish, which is obviously the understatement of the century. Our children are dying of hunger. Well, yes, when you start to go after the children, that's when people tend to, really tend to pay attention, isn't it? In another video, a police car was overturned by protesters seeking freedom. Social media evidence of protests in San Antonio de los Baños in Palmas Soriano, the New York Times reported. Now this is interesting because I'm pretty on top of it when it comes to most things, but even I'm a little skeptical when the New York Times starts to report on, liberty movements in Cuba. Fidel Castro is, of course, one of these people's favorite heroes. So let's take some of this with a grain of salt. Not that it's not a good thing that people of Cuba are fed up. Don't get me wrong, that is fantastic. But let us consider the sources as we go along. It is the most massive popular demonstration to protest the government that we have experienced in Cuba since 1959. What has happened is enormous. Julie Chung, an acting Assistant Secretary of the State of the Western Hemisphere Affairs, aka a globalist, expressed concern on Twitter about reported calls to combat against the protesters. She was the most senior Biden administration official to comment publicly on the unrest in Havana on Sunday. So, by the way, all of these movements in Cuba against communism are being dubbed as peaceful protests, but the January 6th protest to, restore the validity of our election was not a peaceful protest. Just a daily reminder to those of you. Please remember Ashley Babbitt and her noble sacrifice and all the other patriots who have been unjustly jailed and have been sent and have been given court dates for that event. Just a reminder that, it was a largely peaceful protest, but again, we do digress. Protests are growing in Cuba as the Cuban people exercise their right to peaceful assembly. Is that a right in Cuba? I'm curious. Is that actually a right in the Cuban dictatorship? To express concern about rising COVID cases and deaths and medicine shortages. Of course, they are protesting that. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, please consider the source. Politicians in Florida, home to a large Cuban diaspora, largely consisting of refugees who fled the communist tyranny set up by Fidel Castro, applauded the demonstrations and called for more U.S. action. And by the way, most of those Cuban diaspora are voting GOP. So, let us remember that this is not a left-wing demonstration for free speech. This is a very right-wing movement to get rid of communism. And apparently it's been going on since Sunday, since yesterday. And that is a good thing, and we should support it. However, the spin from this, what article is this? From the Washington Times. Yeah, don't buy into it. Most of you are smart enough to read between the lines and understand what's actually happening here. We got comments from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, the base Florida man, who says Florida supports the people of Cuba as they take to the streets against the tyrannical regime in Havana. The Cuban dictatorship has repressed the people of Cuba for decades and is now trying to silence those who have the courage to speak out against its disastrous policies. Marco Rubio said something, but we don't give a fuck about him because he's a rhino in chief. Like, literally, fuck little Marco. No one cares about him. And that is pretty much what we've got from Cuba. And it's just fascinating how all of a sudden Fidel Castro is now persona non grata. All of these uprisings are, of course, legitimate, and we should be careful and thoughtful towards them. And we should, but let's not buy into the narrative that this is, COVID related. It has it has much less to do with medicine shortages and far more to do with, the fact that people can't eat. And the fact that, Cuba is shutting down on social media, which we, too, in the West need to get ourselves in order about. And on that regard, ladies and gentlemen, just remember to not get swept up by the mainstream narrative in regards to what's going on with Cuba. Support the protests against communism, and do so for the right reasons. As always, I am Carnal. God bless.